Well, my name's Gillian Caldwell, and I am the Chief Climate Officer for the U.S. Agency for International Development, and I'm also a Deputy Assistant Administrator overseeing a broad range of our climate and biodiversity and energy work. I'm happy to be here.
Gillian, earlier this year, Usaid launched a new climate strategy. What are the main objectives of this new strategy? What is the budget that you have to implement it? And what are the actions that you have already been able to start working on?
Sure. So we launched a brand new strategy at Usaid on Earth Day, April 22nd of last year. And that strategy will take us through 2030. And it represents the most ambitious strategy USAID has ever launched to try to tackle the climate crisis. And in fact, agencies across the Biden administration are all being tasked with getting very ambitious with respect to climate mitigation and adaptation. So the strategy sets a series of very ambitious high-level targets for achievement by 2030, including reducing carbon emissions by 6 billion tons. That's about all the US emissions in an entire year, so substantial carbon emissions reductions. Also, much of that will be achieved through nature-based solutions. So we want to protect and preserve 100 million hectares of carbon-critical landscapes. We also want to, through the President's Prepare initiative on adaptation and resilience, USAID is a lead implementer, and we want to increase the resilience and adaptive capacity of 500 million people, 500 million people worldwide. And finally, we want to ensure systems changing interventions in at least 40 countries worldwide to increase the participation of marginalized communities, such as Indigenous people and local communities, women and youth.
But what is the size? What is the budget that you have to implement this very ambitious strategy?
The budget for USAID as a whole is about $25 billion in the current fiscal year. And Administrator Power, who leads our agency, is repeatedly referring to USAID as a climate agency. So on some level, we're thinking about what we can do with all $25 billion. In terms of the actually specifically designated climate budget, that's more on the neighborhood of 600 million of the 25 billion.
And how are you planning to work with countries such as Brazil on the conservation, restoration, and management of 100 million hectares?
Yes, we're already very active in Brazil. Our biodiversity work in Brazil last year protected habitats for endangered species and, ensured positive impacts on 45 million hectares of land throughout Brazil. You can see that as an area that larger than California. We're also contributing to over 300 million metric tons of greenhouse gas emissions avoided. We've also strengthened the management of 189 protected areas in Brazil, and 83% of those are indigenous peoples, Quilombola, Afro-Brazilian land. And in general, we have, as I mentioned, through the climate strategy, a core emphasis on elevating and engaging indigenous people and local communities in all of our partner work and design. And that's because indigenous communities are stewarding the most carbon critical landscapes in the world.
And to what extent the dismantling of environmental policies are affecting what you're trying to do in the country?
I mean, we have a cooperation with the Brazilian government to protect biodiversity. We're focused on collaborating as closely as we can, not just with the national government, but also with the subnational regional governments within Brazil, which is where we have close collaboration.
In your opinion, how does the adaptation and resilience agenda need to be updated or modified in order to consider the latest extreme events, not only in the USA, but around the world?
There's 3 core things we're focused on. First is supporting the work of scientists and meteorologists and decision makers in communities to strengthen early warning systems and other climate information services. That's in line with the UN Secretary General's call of early warning for all. There are many communities that don't get advance warning of extreme weather or climate events that could threaten their lives and livelihoods. And with even 24 hours of advance notice, we can substantially reduce the risk and the loss to lives and livelihoods. So first is the information systems. Second, we're supporting local efforts to integrate climate adaptation best practice into national and local planning, policy, and budgets. So if you look at the planning, policy, and budgets for infrastructure and health and water and food security and displacement and migration, climate risks are not always addressed systematically. So we're providing the technical expertise to ensure that that climate analysis is embedded into the design for all of those programs. And thirdly, we really want to try to address the shortfall in financial investments in climate adaptation. I mentioned our goal to catalyze $150 billion in public and private finance. And a big emphasis there needs to be on adaptation. The private sector is investing in climate responses, especially mitigation to some extent, but only 3% of private dollars are going to adaptation. And we know that we need $3 to $5 trillion a year to address by 2030 to address the global needs on mitigation and adaptation. So that's almost 600% increase on the total, public and private funds going towards climate response at this stage. We have to accelerate the investment so substantially.
What is USAID's role in the implementation of the International Climate Finance Plan, and what has happened up to now?
We're looking to catalyze $150 billion in public and private climate finance by 2030, and we're focusing in 4 key areas. The first is really providing the technical assistance and the pipeline development to ensure that the private sector has access to credible and investable projects in mitigation and adaptation. If you look at the proliferation of net zero commitments globally at Glasgow and beyond, you can see that there are just billions of dollars of private sector investment standing by waiting for the right opportunity to invest in climate positive projects. And many private sector investors will say there just aren't enough projects that have the credibility or integrity they're looking for. So I think pipeline development is one key area for USAID to support. The second is really addressing what we call the enabling environment. So supporting governments to increase investment by ensuring that the right policies and tax incentives are in place. So you're not likely to stimulate investment in your renewable energy economy if you haven't provided tax credits, such as those the Inflation Reduction Act in the U.S. just offered. The $369 billion that the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act has directed towards the renewable energy transition has already yielded results. We're seeing billions of dollars of new commitments. The third is using our convening power to bring a variety of stakeholders together. So those could be governments, they could be private investors, they could be the multilateral institutions, such as the World Bank, to really ensure we're combining forces to maximize our investment potential. And then finally, we are increasing the use of innovative financial tools. So, as an aid agency, obviously we can provide grants, which can help reduce the risk of a private sector investment. We can provide something equivalent to a first loss guarantee as well. So what we want to do is provide concessional capital that reduces the perceived risk and increases the potential return for private sector investment.
President Biden was willing to mobilize over $11 billion of climate finance for developing countries, which was not possible. In your view, how to mobilize financial resources for the climate crisis agenda at this very crucial but quite challenging moment we are going through?
President Biden committed to quadrupling U.S. climate finance to $11.4 billion by 2024, and that commitment remains steadfast. Obviously, we need congressional support to do it, but the president is committed to meeting the commitment that he made. And if appropriated, again, this is up to our Congress, but the president's fiscal 23 budget, which is a year in advance of 24 as promised, would deliver on that pledge through a combination of direct and indirect funding.
What are your views on the voluntary carbon markets, which many consider one of the most relevant funding sources, while others describe as harmful for local communities and even ineffective for the reductions of emissions?
Well, I think carbon markets are one of many tools for catalyzing the sort of whole of system and economy shifts we need to tackle the crisis. It's absolutely true that in some situations, carbon markets have proven ineffective in mobilizing finance for local communities or in yielding real conservation benefits. But at the same time, the voluntary carbon market is growing exponentially. I mean, it was already valued at $2 billion in 2021. So we've got to get it right. It's happening, whether you like it or not. And my focus is on ensuring that it's as high integrity and as equitable as possible. So we need transparent data and monitoring to ensure that the emissions reductions are real and that the funds generated through emissions reductions actually benefit local communities. In Brazil, the Amazon Biodiversity Fund just signed a $2 million contract with a reforestation carbon business connected to the international voluntary carbon market. And the goal there is to reforest 2,000 hectares of degraded land.
I am aware this is beyond your mandate, but I couldn't avoid asking you, what excites you most and what frustrates you most about the Inflation Reduction Act?
It's undoubtedly the single most important legislation the United States has ever passed to tackle the climate crisis. It's not perfect. Compromises had to be made in order to get all the Democrats necessary to pass the legislation. And unfortunately, not a single Republican in either House of Congress voted to support the passage of the act. It's the largest investment in combating climate change in U.S. history, with $369 billion targeted for transition to a renewable energy economy. So, the concerns are that we really shouldn't be making more investments in fossil fuel infrastructure given the crisis that we're experiencing when it comes to climate.
The last question, Gillian. The American way of life is a role model for Brazil's middle class. It's also considered super individualistic and not sustainable at all. Would you say that the climate crisis is having any influence on this?
In the United States, we're well known for being a leader in producing things and, on some level for advancing a sort of a materialistic culture. I mean, we actually lead the world in waste production. And unfortunately, much of the rest of the world wants to follow our example thanks to this sort of omnipresent media globally sort of driving home the need to consume bigger and better. So, in the past 3 decades alone, 1/3 of the planet's natural resources have been consumed. That's completely unsustainable. So we need to move toward a circular economy where products and parts and materials have multiple life cycles and re-entry points into the market so that they're systematically recovered and repaired and reused and remade. This is especially true where we're talking about batteries, for example. I mean, the demand for batteries is just skyrocketing given all of the new mandates on electric vehicles. California is soon going to be prohibiting the sale of any new vehicles that aren't electric. And there's limited supply for the materials necessary to produce batteries. So we need to move to much more circular economy orientation. And we need people to better understand the impacts of overconsumption on our planet
Thank you so much once again, Gillian. I learned a lot throughout this interview, and it's very exciting what's going on in the USA at the moment.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Bye-bye.